In the late 70s and early 80s, around Major League Baseball, sports, and much of America, there was an underlying problem with cocaine. And in 1985, Major League Baseball would be hit with a trial that had a huge impact on the game and society as a whole, involving players, coaches, outsiders, and even mascots. So, let's sniff our way through this story.
Totally sports-esque. Major League.
In the 70s and 80s, cocaine wasn't too hard to find, especially in the big cities. Everyone from entertainers to athletes to ping pong groupies were involved, and it wasn't designated to one city or region, as noses were being filled across the country. But the city most notable in this situation is Pittsburgh, and that's because the origin of the scandal and the trial begins there. The end of the 70s was a time of glory for Pittsburgh sports. The Steelers won their fourth Super Bowl of the decade in 1979, and the Pirates won their second World Series of the decade against the Orioles and fifth overall that same year. The 1979 team was known as the We Are Family Pirates and featured the likes of Willie Stargell, Dave Parker, and Al Oliver. But once things turned to the 1980s, they went back to mediocrity. And in the midst of the Pirates' dominance in the 70s and fall from grace in the 80s, cocaine made its way into town, going from a drug mainly used by the wealthy such as lawyers and doctors, to one that the average person could get their nose on. And naturally, ball players didn't have to try too hard to get a part of the piece. Oftentimes, ball players could walk into clubs and it was simply offered to them. Players had dealers, connections, and the money for it. And amongst the players falling victim to the drug in the Pittsburgh area, perhaps the one most affected and the one who kickstarted the investigation was pitcher Rod Scurry. Scurry made his debut in 1980 with the Pirates and lasted until 1985. And in this time, he developed what he called a $100,000 a year problem. The problem escalated to an incident in San Diego, where after getting his coke delivered in a baseball glove, Scurry began destroying his hotel room and breaking the television into hundreds of pieces because he thought there were snakes inside of there. Security made their way up to the scene, and eventually, so did manager Chuck Tanner. He told Scurry that he'd either turn himself in or go to rehab. And as he went through rehab, FBI agents were eager to talk to him. And when they did get to talk to him, Scurry revealed that this problem was definitely not limited to one person, and definitely not limited to one team. After investigation and questioning the various baseball players, 7 Pittsburgh area men, all non-players, were indicted. But the one who received the most publicity was Curtis Strong. Strong was actually a caterer for the Philadelphia Phillies, and as he says, he was basically a baseball groupie, who, like all those indicted, really wanted to be a part of what was going on and wanted to be friends with the ball players. But perhaps the reason Strong's case was the most prominent was because of his defense attorney, Adam Renfro Jr., who famously said, "My client is not on trial. Baseball is on trial." As he put it, he was defending the little man who was going against the big man. The trial became national news, and the baseball world stopped focusing on the September pennant races for this. And in the trial, numerous players who were granted immunity in exchange for their testimony would reveal rather shocking truths. Perhaps the most notable to testify was Keith Hernandez. In his testimony, he said that the year of 1980 was the romance year of cocaine in baseball. He even said that he had a hard time recalling the year of 1980 because he was taking so much. Hernandez called the drug the demon of the earth, causing him to wake up with the shakes, nosebleeds, and causing him to drastically lose weight. He even testified that over 40% of Major League players have been using the drug, though he admitted he could have been very wrong. Players such as Dave Parker, Lonnie Smith, Jeff Leonard, and Enos Cabell admitted getting in contact with Strong, arranging meetings over the phone that would later take place in hotel rooms. Tim Raines admitted in the testimony that he kept a gram in the back pocket of his uniform and only slid headfirst to not break the veil. And one of the more interesting and comedic revelations came in regards to Kevin Koch, who often brought cocaine to the games with him. And why was he there? Because he was the Pittsburgh Parrot mascot. Had he been the Philly fanatic, he would have had a much easier time getting his nose in there. But perhaps the most unexpected revelation in the trial were the additional drugs that were being used. Dale Barra said in his testimony that Willie Stargell and Bill Madlock gave him amphetamines, a drug now banned by the MLB. The pills were known as greenies, and were very common in the league, and with other veterans taking the pills, he didn't see anything wrong with them. Another shocking revelation from the trial came from John Milner, who said he received amphetamines from another veteran, this one being Willie Mays, who he said had the red juice, containing amphetamines dissolved in liquid, though he never actually saw Mays drink the red juice. And in the end, all 7 men on trial would be convicted. Curtis Strong received a 12-year prison sentence, but only served 4. Dale Schiffman was sentenced to 12 years and served 2 years in federal penitentiary. Shelby Greer pled guilty to 7 counts, Thomas Bowser was sentenced to 18 months in prison, Kevin Connolly was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison, Jeffrey Moscow spent 18 months in prison, and Robert McHugh was sentenced to 10 years. But the main fallout out of all this as far as baseball is the impact it had on fans. This wasn't the first news of the drug making its way into baseball. Lonnie Smith actually had a publicized stint in rehab in 1983 that kept him sidelined for over a month. And prior to the trial in 1985, Mark Leibel was arrested in connection with the Kansas City Royals. And funny enough, the Royals won the World Series that year. But what the Pittsburgh drug trials really detailed was the extent of the problem, and the one tasked with breaking the negative perception, preserving baseball's integrity, and handling possible disciplinary action was Commissioner Peter Ueberroth. Naturally, he received much criticism before and after the trial, given the tough circumstances he was facing. Ueberroth's announced goal was to make baseball a clean sport, the first and only one, and the way he planned on doing that was increased drug testing and penalties. But the biggest hurdle for him was the union, and especially in regards to random testing, the union was not going to budge, even as Ueberroth worked behind the scenes to persuade the union. But from the beginning, Ueberroth didn't seem eager to punish players. As he said in the early development of the case, "I don't want to attack baseball players. I don't see my main role as commissioner to punish people." In a sense, it reflects the actions of many United States attorney offices at the time, who wanted to punish the suppliers more than the users. And if players had any more worries about disciplinary action, Keith Hernandez himself said that he had a meeting with Ueberroth in late September of 1985. Hernandez said that Ueberroth told him that he didn't have to worry about getting suspended and to just play ball. And the New York Post even reported that sources said that Hernandez was not going to have any disciplinary action taken against him. Ueberroth did have one-on-one meetings with 23 players and one coach during the offseason, which were described as routine and nothing new. But in February of that year, as spring training was about to get underway, Ueberroth surprised everyone by announcing punishments for players. He divided 21 players into 3 different groups. The first group featured Andujar, Berra, Cabell, Hernandez, Smith, Parker, and Leonard, and they were to receive 1-year suspensions without pay, unless they donate 10% of their 1986 salary to a drug abuse prevention facility, perform 100 hours of drug-related community service in each of the next 2 years, and participate in random testing for the rest of their career. Players in other categories received similar punishments that weren't as severe. All 7 would comply, but naturally, they weren't all happy. Keith Hernandez was one of those not happy. Before even making the decision, he said that Ueberroth should have made the decision a month prior, so there wasn't a cloud over the game as the season started. He continued to say that Ueberroth doesn't care about the game, and past criticisms about Ueberroth using the situation to promote himself returned. One journalist said, "Peter Ueberroth would rather have people talking about drugs and Peter Ueberroth, not necessarily in that order." Ueberroth is being seen by many today as the champion drug buster of the free world. He has done everything but dress himself in tights and a cape with his initials on his chest. But aside from just criticism directed at Ueberroth, a lot of criticism, especially in the decades to follow, was pointed at Major League Baseball as a whole. Executives such as John McHale, who was president of the Montreal Expos, said that the cocaine problem slipped into the back door, and even argues that the problem hurt the Expos' chances of winning the division in 1982. And teams like the Pirates can argue that this was the reason for the collapse of their dynasty. In 1980, Terry Pluto of the Cleveland Plain Dealer took a survey of coaches, executives, and players, and estimates were made that between 10 to 12% of players used coke, a smaller percent than what Keith Hernandez estimated during the trial, though he even said that may have been an overestimation. Obviously, the main criticism directed towards the league is that they did not do enough to prevent the situation from escalating. Cocaine use in baseball wasn't a secret in the late 70s and early 80s. Players, coaches, executives all knew what was going on, but it wasn't until the problem leaked out to the public and led to extensive news coverage of the trials that Major League Baseball took serious action. But the question is, did they take enough action? On Halloween Eve in 1985, Ueberroth spoke at a luncheon in Washington, D.C. during a tribute to Nancy Reagan and the launch of the Girl Scouts drug abuse program, and during this, he announced that he would guarantee the complete elimination of drugs in professional baseball. In the following year, players such as Keith Hernandez said that baseball is drug-free, and Al Holland added that baseball is done with drugs. It's not like that anymore in baseball. You do it now and you're nobody. MLB's crackdown on the drug mirrored the growing campaign against drugs in the country, and with the tragic death of the NBA's second overall pick in 1986, Len Bias, the campaign in sports specifically was heightened. While players like Keith Hernandez and Al Holland felt that baseball was drug-free, players such as Lonnie Smith disagreed with the notion. Part of his agreement was that he was supposed to be tested 6 to 8 times per year. but in July of 1987, he said he had not been tested yet that year. Ubrost's office responded by saying that their main concern was that Smith was clean, not that he had been tested, and reiterated that the testing was random. But regardless of the claims on both sides, anyone who knows anything about the next decade of baseball knows that baseball wasn't exactly clean. If there was ever a time to implement random drug testing for players, it was after the Pittsburgh drug trials. But as mentioned, the unions were too strong, and it's interesting to see how much the cocaine era of the 70s and 80s matched that of the steroid era. Like the problems with coke in the 70s and 80s, steroids were definitely not a secret and limited to one person or team. The use of amphetamines was already prevalent and mentioned in the drug trials, though they were not banned yet, and players such as Goose argued that they were not performance-enhancing drugs to the likes of anabolic steroids. In 1988 brought the first major story of steroid use when Jose Canseco was accused of using the drug by Thomas Boswell. Canseco would of course deny the allegations and go on to win the MVP that year. 3 years later, Commissioner Fay Vincent would add steroids to the MLB's ban list, but there were no plans for testing, and coming out of the strike in 1995, Bud Selig would say when asked about steroid use from the Sporting News, "If baseball has a problem, I must candidly say that we are not aware of it. It certainly hasn't been talked about much, but should we concern ourselves as an industry, maybe it's time to bring it up again." And well, Major League Baseball didn't exactly look that hard into it. And of course there's the added fact that from a business standpoint, it was better they not look into it. Attendance and revenue was way down coming off of the strike, and the home run chase of 1998 brought everyone back and more engaged than ever before. And it wasn't until 3 years after the chase when the first random drug testing program was implemented in baseball, this one making its way to the minor leagues. And in that same year, Barry Bonds would break the single season home run record set by Mark McGwire 3 years prior. And in 2002, Ken Caminiti admitted to steroid use, and this is seen by many as the unraveling of it all. For the first time since the drug trials in 1985, players and owners met to start a new anonymous drug testing program, and over the next year, numerous players would test positive, admit to use, and some are even called to testify in front of a grand jury, giving baseball its biggest setback since the drug trials of 1985, and one that led to new policies regarding drug use in today's game. But looking back at the drug trials of 1985, it in a sense is the precursor to the steroid era that was to follow. Arguments could be made that the MLB opened the door for steroid use with the disciplinary action taken in 1986. The ones who were caught and punished didn't miss any playing time and were the only ones subjected to random testing. Both the coke problem in the 70s and 80s and the steroid problem in the decades to come were issues the MLB turned a blind eye to until it escalated into the public eye. A lack of motivation and resources, along with less power than they expected to have, led to both scandals that impacted the game in years to come. And in the end, both scandals in the fall of the Pittsburgh Pirates in the 80s can be blamed on the Pirate Parrot and his nostrils.